Picture yourself lying on a steel table in the sick bay of a Canadian warship, off the coast of Korea, in the year 1951. There is a war on above the waterline, and you have been carried down here bleeding, one of a handful of badly wounded men brought aboard, and you are frightened in the specific way. A man is frightened when the thing that can save him is another man's hands. And here he comes, the ship's surgeon in his uniform, calm, unhurried, giving quiet orders that everyone around him obeys. He examines you. He tells you there's a bullet lodged deep near the heart and that he is going to take it out, and something in the flat sureness of his voice lets you breathe. He scrubs. He picks up the instruments, and a little while later the bullet is out and you are stitched and you are going to live. And this doctor has just done, in the belly of a rolling destroyer, a piece of surgery that would have made a peacetime hospital nervous. Now, hold that man in your mind, the calm one, the sure one, the one whose steady voice let you close your eyes, because he never went to medical school. He has no medical degree. He has never held a surgeon's post in his life. The name stitched on his uniform is not his name. It belongs to a real doctor 1,000 miles away who has no idea it's at sea. The night before your operation, he sat alone in a cabin with a borrowed textbook, reading the chapter on how to do the thing he was about to do to you. And the truly unbearable part, the part that is going to sit with you for the rest of this story, is that he did it well. You lived. They all lived. And by the time we are done, you are going to have to sit with the most uncomfortable question this whole channel has ever handed you, which is not how did a fraud fool the Navy, but something a great deal closer to home. If the fake was that good, what exactly were the real ones being paid for? Hello, I'm Eddie. Pull up a chair, mind the mug, it's been there since Tuesday. If you're new to this little corner, here's the arrangement. I take the greatest impostors and swindlers in history down off the shelf, hold them up to the light, and marvel at the nerve of them. Because I'll admit it before my lawyer wakes up, a man with a hopeless soft spot for a beautiful piece of cheek. Never pulled one myself, for the record. The nearest I ever got was letting a very grand hotel assume, for one glorious weekend, that my mate Sully and I were something to do with the visiting orchestra, purely on the strength of Sully carrying a cello case. There was no cello. There was, I later learned, a folding chair. We were asked to leave before the second night. So no, I'm not the operator. I'm the fellow in the cheap seats leaning forward, whispering how in the world did he get away with that. And tonight is different, and I want you to know that going in, because most of my beautiful liars were after your money. This one wasn't. Not really. This one wanted something stranger, and when you sit with it sadder, he didn't want to be rich. He wanted to be somebody respected, somebody important, somebody the room turns to when the hard thing needs doing. And to get it he became, over one restless lifetime, a monk, a psychologist, a college dean, a prison warden, a deputy sheriff, a cancer researcher. And I still can't quite believe I'm about to tell you this as fact, a surgeon on a warship at war, cutting into real wounded men, with no more medical training than a library card and a photographic memory. His name, his actual name, the one he kept running away from, was Ferdinand Waldo Demara. The newspapers called him the Great Impostor. And I warn you now, you'll spend the first half of this laughing at his gall, and the second half deeply unsettled, because he holds up a mirror to something we would all much rather not look at. So let me tell you about the man with no degrees who operated on wounded sailors, and got it right. Here's what we can say with reasonable confidence, and then I'm going to be honest with you about the parts we can't, because with this man especially that honesty matters, and I'll tell you exactly why in a moment. Ferdinand Waldo Demara Jr. was born in Lawrence, Massachusetts, in December of 1921. His family was comfortable. His father ran a business tied to the local movie houses, until the Depression came through and took the comfortable part away, and young Ferdinand went, more or less overnight, from a boy with standing in his town to a boy with none. Keep that in your pocket. It matters more than any single con he ever ran. Now here's the caveat, and it's a big one. So much of what we know about Demara comes to us through two gorgeous, unreliable filters. The first is a biography, Robert Crichton's book The Great Impostor, published in 1959, and its sequel 2 years later, written with Demara's cooperation, which is to say written with the cooperation of a man whose entire genius was making people believe a flattering story. The second is the 1961 Hollywood film they made of that book, with Tony Curtis playing him as a lovable rogue, which smoothed every rough edge the biography had left. So a great deal of the delicious detail you're about to hear, the exact drama of the surgery, the perfect timing, the twinkle in his eye, has been buffed and lit and scored by people who wanted him charming. When I hand you a perfect scene, hear the word reportedly hiding inside it. But the spine, a man with no qualifications who repeatedly, verifiably, talked and forged his way into jobs that should have been impossible, including a surgeon's post on a Canadian destroyer in the Korean War. That part is solid, and it's confirmed by the thing that finally caught him, which we'll come to. The spine is more than enough. So let's start where it started, because you cannot understand the surgeon without the runaway. Somewhere in his teens, Ferdinand Demara ran. Not to the circus, not to sea, he ran to a monastery. He turned up at the door of a Trappist order, one of the strictest, most silent, most demanding religious lives a man can choose, and he asked to be let in, and he was. And I want you to notice what he reached for first, because it's the whole man in miniature. A boy who had lost his family's standing didn't reach for money. He reached for a place that would make him instantly, unquestionably somebody. Somebody with a role, a robe, a rule, a reason to be respected. The monastery didn't last. Almost nothing ever lasted with Demara, and that restlessness is the engine of the entire tragedy. But the shape is already there. Find an institution that hands out identity and belonging and walk in wearing the right face. Then came the war years, and here the pattern hardens into method. He joined the army. He didn't care for it, so he did the thing that tells you everything about how his mind worked. He didn't just desert. He faked his own death. The story goes that he left his clothes on a riverbank or a pier, arranged to suggest a man had drowned himself, and simply walked away from the name Ferdinand Demara into a brand new one. And this becomes his signature move. He didn't invent people out of thin air most of the time. He borrowed real ones. He'd find a genuine professional, a real doctor, a real academic, a real man with real degrees, learn the shape of that man's credentials, and then wear the name like a coat. Because a made-up doctor can be checked and found missing. A real doctor, borrowed, checks out beautifully, right up until the real one walks into the room. One of the earliest and most useful of these borrowed men was a Dr. Robert Linton French, a psychologist. Under that name and that man's qualifications, Demara taught. He lectured on psychology. He is said to have held a serious academic post, a dean of philosophy at one small college, a teacher at others, standing in front of rooms full of students who trusted every word, none of whom had the faintest idea that the learned doctor at the lectern had never sat the exams he was supposedly grading them toward. And by every account that comes down to us, He was good at it. Not passable. Good, the students liked him. That detail is going to keep coming back, and every time it does I want it to bother you a little more. So how? How does a man with no papers walk into a locked profession and simply belong? And here I have to be careful because I love the sheer audacity of this and I'm going to show it to you, but I'm showing you a specimen behind glass, not handing you a lockpick. This is a warning with the mechanism visible, not a manual. Understood? Good. Demara understood something most honest people never have to think about, which is that in the real world, almost nobody checks. We like to imagine there's a great machine of verification standing behind every professional. That when a man says he's a doctor, or a dean, or a warden, someone somewhere has pulled the file and confirmed it. And sometimes at the front door someone has. But once you are inside, once you are wearing the coat and using the vocabulary and behaving with the unhurried authority of a man who has every right to be there, the checking stops. Nobody re-verifies the surgeon mid-operation. Nobody asks the dean to produce his diploma at the faculty lunch. Authority, once granted, runs on momentum, and Demara's true genius was for the granting moment, the interview, the arrival, the first impression, after which the momentum carried him. He had two things that made it work. He had a genuinely extraordinary memory. He could absorb a manual, a textbook, a body of jargon at frightening speed and give it back with total confidence. And he had nerve, that flat, calm, sure-voiced nerve you met on the operating table, the manner of a man who has decided completely that he belongs, so that questioning him would feel like the rude thing to do. Rule one of any con, my friend. The uniform does more work than the man inside it. People don't respond to who you are. They can't see who you are. They respond to the costume, the title, the calm, the paperwork, the signals of competence, and Demara grasped, all the way down, that if you master the signals flawlessly enough, hardly anyone ever troubles to look for the thing the signals are supposed to point at. He didn't counterfeit competence for its own sake. He counterfeited the appearance of it and trusted the world's politeness to fill in the rest. And here's where his story takes the turn that separates it from every other con I've ever shown you, the turn that makes it genuinely disturbing instead of merely delicious. Because most imposters are frauds all the way through. The fake doctor is a bad doctor. The fake expert is an empty suit. Demara kept being, infuriatingly, actually good at the jobs he stole. Take the prison. At one point, under yet another borrowed name, Ben Jones, Demara talked his way into a post at a maximum security prison in Texas, and not as a clerk. He ended up as an assistant warden, responsible for one of the toughest, most dangerous wings in the system, full of men who had done genuinely frightening things. A fraud with no training, handed real power over real violent men. And what did he do with it? He reformed the place. He took an interest in the prisoners as people, started rehabilitation efforts, earned a measure of trust in a wing that ran on fear. By the accounts that come down to us, he was one of the better administrators that wing had seen. He was undone there not by incompetence but by a magazine. A prisoner, of all people, recognized his face from a story about a famous impostor and quietly worked out that the man running his cell block was the very fraud he'd been reading about. Sit with the strangeness of that. The impostor was good at being a warden. The system he'd cheated his way into was, for a while, better for his cheating. But the masterpiece, the one that made him a household name, was the surgery. And to tell it, I have to introduce the man whose life he borrowed, because this is the part where the cost of what Demara did stops being funny. There was a real doctor named Joseph Sear, a genuine, qualified Canadian physician, a decent man going about his practice. Demara got close to him, learned the shape of his credentials, and then took his name to sea. As Dr. Joseph Sear, Surgeon Lieutenant, he was commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy and posted, during the Korean War, to a destroyer called HMCS Cayuga. Now think about the position he'd walked into. A warship is one of the very few places on Earth where a man cannot quietly underperform and coast. On a destroyer at war, the ship's doctor is often the only medical authority for a great distance of ocean. When wounded men come aboard, there is no colleague to hand them to, no bigger hospital down the corridor. There is you, and there is the sea. And the wounded did come. The famous account has the Cayuga taking aboard badly hurt men, South Korean soldiers, in the usual telling, with injuries far beyond anything a ship's sick bay is meant to handle, including the man with the bullet lodged near his heart. So what does a fraud do, cornered at last in a situation where the performance has to become real or men will die? He does the most Demara thing imaginable. He asks for a little time. He goes to his cabin with a medical textbook and he reads fast, that photographic memory swallowing the pages, the procedures he is about to perform. And then he scrubs up and he performs them. Chest surgery, the removal of the bullet, serious operations improvised from a book by a man who had never so much as assisted at one. And here is the sentence I still can't quite make my mouth believe: it worked. The patients, by the accounts we have, survived. The fraud saved their lives. I have to plant a flag right here because I promised you honesty, and this is exactly where the legend does its heaviest lifting. Precisely how dramatic, how solo, how against the odds those operations truly were. That's the part most polished by Crichton's admiring biography and by a Hollywood film that wanted a hero. It's likely he had trained hands helping him. Likely the tale got grander with each retelling, as tales do. So hold the cinematic version loosely. But the bones are not in dispute. A man with no medical qualifications served as a naval surgeon in wartime and treated wounded men well enough that not one patient's death gave him away. He wasn't caught because someone died on his table. He was caught because he was too good and got famous for it. Because that's the beautiful, ridiculous irony at the heart of the whole thing. The tell that undoes him is not failure, it's success. The Navy, thrilled to have a surgeon performing near miracles at sea, did the natural thing. They let the story out. It made the papers. Dr. Joseph Sear, the modest hero of HMCS Cayuga, patching up the wounded against all odds. A lovely piece of wartime press. And somewhere in Canada, an ordinary woman opened her newspaper and read about the heroic Dr. Joseph Sear and frowned. Because she was the mother of the real Dr. Joseph Sear. And she knew, with the absolute certainty only a mother has, exactly where her son was, and it was not on a destroyer off Korea performing battlefield surgery. The name in the paper was her son's name. The man in the paper was not her son, and she said so. That's how it ends. Not a detective, not a suspicious admiral, not a botched operation, a mother who knew her own boy reading the news. The very fame that crowned the imposture was the thing that shattered it. And the man who had spent a lifetime borrowing other people's names was undone by the one person on earth who could not be fooled about whose name it really was. And now comes the detail that tells you this was never an ordinary crime. When the Royal Canadian Navy worked out what had happened, that their heroic surgeon was a fraud with no medical training whatsoever, they had a genuine problem. What exactly do you charge him with? He had held a commission fraudulently, yes. But he hadn't killed anyone. He hadn't maimed a soul. By every account, he had done the job, the impossible, unqualified, morally staggering job, and done it competently, and the men he treated had lived. There was no trail of dead patients to prosecute, only a mountain of embarrassment. So they did the quiet thing. They discharged him and hushed it as best they could, and Ferdinand Demara walked away from yet another borrowed life, out into the world to do it all again. But the newspaper genie was out of the bottle now, and it would never go back in. In early 1952, Life magazine, one of the biggest, most read publications in America, ran a great splashy exposé on him, the master impostor, complete with his photograph. And that photograph was the beginning of the end of the whole game, because from then on his own face was the one credential he could never forge away. It was a life reader who would later spot him running the Texas prison. It was fame, again and again, that cornered the man who lived by being nobody in particular. The papers had made him a legend, and a legend cannot hide in a borrowed coat, because everyone has already seen the man inside it. He kept trying a teacher here, a counselor there, a few more borrowed skins in a few more towns, but the walls were closing, and each new imposture died a little faster than the last. Because that's the thing you have to understand about him, the thing that lifts this above a caper. He couldn't stop. This wasn't a scheme with a payday and a retirement. When people asked him later, why keep doing it? Why risk prison and disgrace over and over for jobs that never made him rich? The answer he's supposed to have given is chillingly simple. Rascality, pure rascality. But I don't think that's the truth of it, and I don't think he did either. I think the truth is the boy in Lawrence who lost his family's standing and could never, ever get warm again. Being a monk, a dean, a warden, a surgeon, those weren't heists. They were doses. Each one was a hit of the thing he actually craved, which was to walk into a room and have it turned to him with respect. And respect borrowed always runs out, so he always needed more, so he always moved on, one step ahead of the mother with the newspaper. He did it, in the end, dozens of times in a dozen skins, until his own face was too famous to wear anyone else's. And here's the quiet twist the film loved to end on, the one soft mercy in the whole restless story. In his later years, worn out and finally unable to be anyone but himself, Ferdinand Demara went and did the one thing he'd only ever counterfeited before. He trained, honestly, and was genuinely ordained, and he spent his last working years as a real hospital chaplain in California, sitting with the sick and the dying under his own true name at last. The man who had faked belonging his entire life found a little of the real thing right at the end, in a job he was, by all accounts, actually qualified to hold. Whether that's redemption or just exhaustion, I'll let you decide. But there's something that catches in my throat about it, that after all the borrowed coats, the last one that fit was his own. So let's ask the real question, the one that should be nagging at you now the way it nags at me. Not how did he fool them, we've seen how, the borrowed name, the flawless manner, the world that doesn't check once you're through the door. The real question is worse. How is it possible that a man with no training could not only pass as a surgeon, a dean, a warden, but be good at all three? What does that say about the jobs? And I think the uncomfortable answer is this. A very large part of what we call competence in a lot of respected work is confidence, vocabulary, and the willingness to make a decision and stand behind it. Demara had those in abundance, plus a memory that could fake the technical layer on demand. The credential is supposed to guarantee something underneath the manner, real knowledge, real training, real judgment forged over years. But most of the time, in most rooms, nobody ever tests the underneath. We test the manner. We meet the confident, calm, fluent person, and we simply assume the years of training are back there behind the eyes, because checking would be rude and slow and would imply we doubted them. Demara lived his whole life in that gap, the gap between looking competent and being competent. And the horror of his story is not that the gap let a fraud slip through. It's how often and how far the fraud got on manner alone. He is the proof, walking around in a borrowed coat, of how much of the world runs on the costume. Now here's why I really keep this one on the shelf, why I didn't just tell it to you for the sheer fun of the nerve. Because it's about you and me a great deal more than it's about a restless dead man from Massachusetts. It's so easy to sit here and feel safe to think, well, I'd never be fooled, I'd have checked his papers. But you check almost nothing, and neither do I. You walk into a doctor's office and you read the confidence, not the diploma on the wall. When did you last actually read one? You take advice from the man in the good suit with the calm voice and the right words, and you assume the knowledge is really there, because he sounds so completely like it is. We are all, every day, granting authority on the strength of the signals, exactly the way the Cayuga did, and most of the time it's fine, because most people wearing the coat did earn it. But the reflex that makes it fine is the very same reflex Demara lived inside. The instinct not to check. The embarrassment of being the one who asks a confident man to prove it. The quiet assumption that surely someone, somewhere, already did. And it cuts the other way too, which is the half of this that I find almost hopeful and almost frightening at once. Because if a boy with no degrees could become a competent surgeon by reading hard and refusing to flinch, then how much of the confidence that's been quietly keeping you out of some room is real, and how much is just a costume other people learned to wear before you did? Demara is a warning about trusting the manner too easily, but he's also, strangely, a story about how much of expertise is nerve, and how many of the people intimidating you into staying small are, underneath the coat, reading the textbook the night before, just like everybody else. The single tell that would have saved the Cayuga a world of embarrassment, was never does this man seem competent. He seemed magnificently competent. The tell is quieter and ruder, and it's the one we almost never reach for. Has anyone actually, personally, verified the thing the confidence is standing on, or are we all just trusting the uniform and assuming somebody else looked? The moment a person's authority rests on nobody being willing to check it, you are standing exactly where that ship's captain stood, handing a scalpel to a stranger because he had the right name stitched on his chest. So that's my question for you tonight, and I do read the comments, so come and find me down there. When have you trusted the costume? When did you take someone entirely on the strength of the confidence, the title, the calm, certain manner, and were you right too, or did it come apart later? And the flip side, the one I really want. When have you been the one in the borrowed coat, faking the confidence, sure you'd be found out any second, and then quietly discovered you could actually do the thing? Tell me both. The time the manner fooled you, and the time the manner was you. Those stories keep the rest of us honest. Put them below. And if you like sitting in the cheap seats with me, taking history's greatest impostors apart to see what makes them tick, subscribe, and stick around. There's a new one every few days, and I've a whole gallery of beautiful liars still to introduce you to. The woman who convinced a city she was a billionaire's secret heir. The forger who fooled an empire and got paid for it. The man who sold a monument he did not own. My nephew, sharp lad, thinks he's uncatchable, nearly wired his savings last year to a voice on the phone that sounded exactly, calmly, competently like his bank, because it wore all the right signals, and asking it to prove itself felt paranoid and rude. He caught it with a minute to spare, and only because for 1 second he stopped asking, "Does this sound official?" and started asking, "Have I actually checked?" That question is the whole defense. I'll leave you with this. Ferdinand Demara never forced a door or picked a lock. He simply understood that the world hands its trust to whoever wears the coat with enough calm, and that hardly anyone ever asks to see what's underneath. He operated on wounded men from a textbook, and they lived. And that isn't a story about how clever he was. It's a story about how little the rest of us check. So the next time you find yourself handing your money, your health, or your faith to someone purely because they sound so completely like they belong, do the one unglamorous, slightly embarrassing thing that would have caught him years sooner. Ask to see what's under the coat. I'm Eddie. Mind the confident strangers and mind your manners a little less. And that's how you lose your shirt.